Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's session Improving Ransomware Resistance by Enhancing Network Security by our panelists Scott Scober, Roger Smith, Paul Pauls, Justin M. Pelletier, and Senthil Velatham. And I am Richa, and I'll be your host for the day. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few house rules. For our attendees, the session will be in listen only mode and will last for an hour and a half, out of which last 15 minutes will be dedicated to Q&A. If you have any questions during the webinar to organizers or panelists, please post your query in the Q&A window. Also, if you face any audio video challenges, please check your internet connections or you may log out and log in again. An important announcement for a certificate of attendance. Participant needs to attend the complete webinar to qualify for the certificate of attendance. Participants should fill in the survey form in the attendees thank you email and answer the 3 questions based on the webinar provided with the right answers within the same day. If these 2 criteria are met, then only the participant will receive a certificate of attendance within 5 to 7 working days after the event. About our first panelist, Paul Pauls. He is currently the lead of ransomware resilience at Secura BV. Paul Pauls developed the unified kill chain model at the University of Leiden. He holds a Master's of Law degree, a Master's of Art in Applied Ethics, and a Master of Science in Cybersecurity. Our second panelist, Roger Smith, a worldwide influencer and innovator in business security. Roger Smith is not only average risk management, but business security and a cybersecurity director. He's funny, scary on point, and focused on increasing global awareness and understanding of the risk associated with the cyber world. Not only is Roger a veteran, he's also an expert at creating and managing personal, digital, and business network security solutions for home users, small and medium-sized businesses, and for non-profit organizations. Third panelist is Justin Pelletier. Justin Pelletier is a director of the Cyber Range and a training center at RITS Global Security Institute. He trains students' team to perform network security assessments for partner organizations. Dr. Pelletier is also professor of practice in the Department of Computing Security, where he teaches at both the undergraduate and graduate levels and brought the Hacking for Defense initiative to RIT. Outside of these roles, he is a combat veteran and serves as a major in the US Army Reserves. Senthil Velatham. Senthil, a self-described technical evangelist who has been in the industry for 20 years, helping his customers solve their business problem and optimize their IT infrastructure. As a bona fide champion for cloud technology and software as a service, he takes a minimalistic approach to technical management to ensure maximum output. Last but not the least, our moderator and the panelist, Scott Scober, President CEO of Barclays Vetronic Systems, a New Jersey-based provider of world-class wireless test and security solution. Scott Scober is an author of 3 best-selling books on cybersecurity: Hacked Again, Cybersecurity is Everybody's Business, and Senior Cyber War. World-renowned expert for live security events and media appearances, frequently appearing on ABC News, Bloomberg TV, CNN, more to discuss various topics including ransomware, wireless threat, drone surveillance, hacking and cybersecurity, consumers and small businesses. Scott is in high demand. He's also served as the CSO and Chief Media Commentator for Cybersecurity Venture. So without any further delay, I would hand over the session to you, Scott.
Great. Hey, thank you so much, Richa, for that wonderful introduction there. And thank EC Council University really for putting together this great webinar. We really look forward to it. And I'm honored because I'm surrounded by 4 people that are far more smarter than myself. So this is going to be a great conversation. Really looking forward to it because we're going to get some different aspects and deeper understanding about ransomware. And certainly I appreciate the fact if you guys listening in, tuning in, you have questions, certainly feed them over because we'd love to be able to weigh in on some of that, and that help you guys will help us steer the conversation a little bit toward the end there. So we look forward to that. But maybe before diving right in, just to kind of to set the landscape and help us to kind of get a sense of how bad of a problem is ransomware. Well, if we just look at its stats alone, an interesting stat last year is ransomware will occur every 11 seconds. And that's kind of astounding to me when you think about how frequent ransomware occurs. We all read the headlines and we almost get complacent about it because we just hear it constantly about all the problems about ransomware. In the US alone, about 4,000 ransomware breaches occur each and every day that are reported, I should say. So probably even more than that. So it's a huge problem, but it's a global problem, not just here in the US. And we also want to keep in mind that the payout has drastically increased. If we look just back a couple of years to 2018, the average ransomware payout was about $5,000. Fast forward to even into 2020 and 2021, it's well over $200,000, the average payout. So you see it's an extremely lucrative business for cyber criminals. And one other point I wanted to share, again, to put it in perspective, is how does it affect us, maybe as universities, as business owners, as consumers even? Well, yesterday there was a report out that Lincoln College, some may have heard about Lincoln College before, or the story here, it was reported to be shutting down. And this university, this college, was founded in 1865, and it was right after Abraham Lincoln, actually. So it was kind of very well known, and it had to shut down mostly in part due to a ransomware attack. So it was that devastating. So on the record, that was the first college noted that had to shut down as a result. And again, ransomware is being targeted in so many different sectors, and we're going to dive into that and talk about that a little bit. So maybe as we set the stage there, let's talk about that, the topic of ransomware. How do we understand this a little bit better? How ransomware attack actually works? And maybe we can even start off with Paul, and you can give us kind of a little bit of an overview from your perspective. And then I would, again, love to hear from some of the other panelists if you want to jump in afterwards. But again, the anatomy of ransomware. Help us out, Paul.
Sure, thanks, Scott. Yeah, I think that's actually a really important point to start with. Like, how do these attacks happen in the first place? I see a lot of misunderstanding about that usually. So the first thing to understand about these ransomware attacks is that they're human driven. So they're not spreading themselves. There are people on the other side of the world who are hacking, making choices along every step of the way that are trying to find their way into your network, through your network, towards critical assets in order to roll out their ransomware. So that is one thing to keep in mind in order to understand what we're actually trying to defend against. And at a high level of abstraction, these ransomware attacks consist of three different phases. So the first phase is trying to get into the networks of organizations. So typically this happens through phishing emails or by exploiting vulnerabilities in internet-facing systems, trying to get into remote working facilities using leaked or guessable credentials. So these are all ways to initially gain a foothold in the network of an organization. And you have to imagine this happens all the time in an indiscriminate way. So they're just firing off whatever exploit they have or sending out the phishing email to all the email addresses that they can find in order basically to infect systems. And only after they have infected systems, then they will try to figure out what is this organization that I have been able to infect. Then they will start looking into the organizations, what their revenue is, what kind of business they're in. And then in the organizations where they think it's worth their while, because maybe the ransomware could have a particularly large effect on the organization, only then they will try to expand their access. So they go from this first initially compromised system, hacking through that network, exploiting vulnerabilities, exploiting misconfigurations, finding their way through that network towards critical assets. And usually what you see happening a lot is that they're focusing on the on-premises systems, particularly Active Directory, trying to escalate their privileges and move laterally with those privileges until they have all the Windows systems in the on-premise setting under their control. And once they've reached that point, that's actually the second cycle, then they will try to seek confidential information that can be stolen and that can be used to extort organizations that do not want to have that information disclosed. So that can be anything from source code to personally identifiable information, tax returns, things about mergers and acquisitions, all that sort of stuff. They will try to steal that. They will also try to target the backups. So if the backups are accessible, they will try to destroy them to make sure that organizations cannot recover from their backups. And once they've done that, they will use the privileges that they have acquired, so typically that of a domain administrator, to roll out their ransomware to all the systems that are compatible within a network. So it's these motions that an attack actually goes through that I try to model in the unified kill chain, that explain how these attacks sort of work from the very beginning, where they're indiscriminately targeting everyone on the internet through hacking these networks that they think may be a gold mine, and then finally them doing their action on their original objectives. So stealing data, destroying backups, and then encrypting all the assets in a network. So if you understand how these attacks actually take place, that also puts you in a better position to figure out what kind of measures can we take in order to reduce the risk of these kinds of attacks. So you do not necessarily have to try to protect your organization against this first step, although that would be great, but that's usually really hard to make sure nobody gets in the first place. But once they're in your network, you can also try to defend that part. So prevent them from going from one compromised endpoint, one compromised workstation because someone clicked on a phishing email, to an attacker having your entire IT infrastructure under control.
Wow. So it really is a lot more to it than some people may even think. Now, I guess hearing all these pieces, all these moving parts, it makes one wonder, is this a hacker in the basement with a hoodie that's doing this? Who typically is behind a lot of these ransomware attacks? Because it takes, as Paul was saying there, a level of understanding and technical ability.
Yeah, I would say there really a ransomware as a service industry has sort of started up. So I explained how these attacks, what kind of phases they go through. So you see some attackers have really specialized in some of these phases. So some attackers may only try to generate infections on individual systems in the first place. So they are like one-trick ponies. They have this exploit. They will try to use it against every system on the internet, or they specialize in phishing, in compromising systems in that way. And then their business model is basically to generate these infections and then to sell them to other groups, maybe ransomware affiliates, who will then do the thing that they're expert in, namely sort of going from an individual compromised workstation to getting a whole network IT infrastructure under control. So it's not even one attacker that's doing this. They've really specialized in all the different parts that are necessary to perform this attack from end to end. And it could be that you're facing multiple different attackers at different stages throughout one of these attacks.
Wow. Justin, do you have a thought to add to that, please?
I do, yeah. And so, thanks, Scott and Paul, for the great explanation. I think one thing that came to mind, Scott, when you asked just now about who's behind it, attribution is tremendously difficult in cybersecurity, which is one of the reasons that criminals like it, and even nations tend to employ it for their own strategic ends. And I think that we can understand maybe a bit more about the motivations behind the individual or the group that conducts the attack, and we can start to use, who wins, why would they be doing this, as a rationale for a potential assessment of attribution. And I say a potential assessment because it is tremendously muddy when we try to prove that it's somebody. It's forensically quite difficult. But I think we do know about the motivations behind who's doing what. And so back before cybersecurity was really an issue, we had espionage problems, and there's a lot of similarity between cyber methods and motivations and traditional espionage methods and motivations. And so the Federal Bureau of Investigation in the United States defined motivations for espionage for those who committed, spied against their country, and they really defined it as really four things: money, ideology, compromise, and ego. MICE is the acronym, right? So money, they're financially motivated, or they're in a tough spot. They need to. There's a classic example. You need to provide some life-saving surgery for a loved one or something like this, and it just so happens that the spy master who's seeking to flip them and get the confidential information is gonna pay them off, and just happens to be the exact dollar amount of the surgery, as example. There's ideology, right? So somebody who's very patriotic or religious or an activist, for a cause. And there's compromise or coercion. Somebody who's got dirt on you, and they just sort of twist that into an espionage act. And then there's ego or excitement, where it's fun and they're looking for thrills and they're kind of the adrenaline junkies in a bad way, and they do it for that reason, right? So that's espionage. But over since then we've seen the understanding of our motivations in the hacker community, in the offensive security community. It's a little bit, I mean, there's obvious overlap, but there's some differences. Money, ego, entertainment, those are still factors. Cause or ideology is a factor. Entrance and status are two that are somewhat new. And so the acronym here is Mises, like you might, joke about the plural of mice is Mises, but the two new ones is entrance and status. And so this is more akin to gang activity. And so somebody who's seeking entrance to an elite group of we all know the Anonymous Collective, somebody who's looking to gain entrance to be considered, a card-carrying member of Anonymous, might seek to perpetrate an attack that's relatively notorious so that they can say, hey, I did this, let me into your, the cool club. And I'm not trying to minimize it. That's actually, I guess a fairly aspirational group among the hacker community. But there's others, right? LulzSec, I mean, there's a bunch. There was a few others, but like LulzSec. But anyway, so status is a little bit different, and that's a little bit beyond entrance, right? And it's sort of proving that you've got the ability to compromise a particularly hardened target. So that's where we start to see, somebody who's been around the community for a while. They've been in the hacker circles for a while, and now they're looking to sort of get that preeminent sort of prestige, the status of being an expert. And so then that's where we see the really kind of hard targets take place. I'd like to, I kind of mentioned that there's, these criminal groups and nations that really enjoy the obfuscation that cyber provides. And so each of those has, there's different motivations. What I just described is really at the individual level, somebody who might conduct cyber espionage, or somebody who might just conduct an attack for financial reasons, or for some other purpose, behind some other motivation. But I think there's a differentiator too with how we might see nations going after other, critical infrastructure sector targets. And I mean, we saw that just recently with Russia and the Ukraine. I know it's been all over the news, but there was what looked like a ransomware attack. It was actually a fake ransomware. It was a wiper. So just wiped out all the information, but it kind of looked like it was a ransomware. So pay this Bitcoin and we'll release your info. And then, apparently some folks tried to pay and they realized, nope, this was they just got some money out of us. Don't pay this thing because they're gonna wipe your stuff anyway.
Yeah.
Anyway, I've kind of went off on a little bit of a tangent maybe, but it's an important question. Why are they doing this and who's behind it all?
No, it's a great point. Great. And maybe Sentinel, do you want to add to that? You look like you had a thought there, please.
Sure. I kind of agree with Justin as well, and what Paul has said. Combining those two together, right? A lot of times when we speak to customers, we find, and we speak to consultants, we find that when they go through the phases of analyzing a customer that's recovered or have been hit with ransomware, we find that typically these are merely entry-level students or people just coming out of college, or people just with too much free time on their hand, just going out online, typical to the scenario of ransomware as a service, just subscribing to that solution and then just going out there, hitting everybody that's out there in the market, right? And it comes to a point where it comes down to organizations retrospectively and see how they are taking the necessary steps to prevent against this 8 out of 10 attacks that comes in. Out of those 8 out of 10, 2 might be the ones that are specialized, were targeted specifically, and they target specific organizations and individuals purely for monetary reasons or political reasons and etc. The rest of them are purely just, let me try this and see if that works. Let me try this organization and see if that works. Typically, that's what they get. And a lot of times organizations fall trapped to that. It's because they don't have a proper rules in place, proper mechanisms in place that could control and mitigate those risks.
Excellent, excellent. Do you want to add anything, Roger, on that?
Yeah, I agree with Senthil. There's a definite difference between the random attacks and the targeted attacks. A random attack literally is someone who's trying to find out how he can do something. But the targeted ones, and these are, as you said, probably 20% of the attacks that are happening, are literally picking a target and finding out how they can get into it and then leveraging that capability. The random ones are someone's got a list of email addresses and they're going to send out something through, as you said, ransomware as a service. And it literally becomes something you've got to start differentiating between how you protect yourself against them. If you focus on the random attacks, then you can reduce the chances of them getting in by doing the right capabilities. But if you know that you're going to be a specific target, you really have to ramp up your security in a specific way to make sure that you are not going to get compromised in a really easy way. And those are the two types of things that we see a lot of. People just don't see the destruction of what one of these things can do.
Yeah, good point. One thing I want to throw in there I thought was interesting, and it kind of came to my mind as Justin was talking. Sometimes the motivation behind some of these things is so interesting, and I'm part of the Espionage Research International group down in DC, so I present each year talking about the latest threats in espionage and things of that nature, usually focused on wireless. And it was interesting. I sat in one of the kind of declassified FBI briefings, and they talked about the top 10 cyber attacks and how they actually work to catch the bad guys. And it was interesting. In all 10 of the cases, the predominant thing that helped law enforcement was their ego, them going out bragging about the success they had. I found it, I was totally surprised. I'm thinking like deep forensics and they're in the dark web and this and that and tracing the cryptocurrency and all these other things. And they're like, no, it's not necessarily that technical. We just monitor a lot of the social media feeds and they start bragging, and that's the starting point where we could move in. I thought that was fascinating to me. So sometimes going back to old school detective work and just, rolling up their sleeves and doing things that law enforcement, the way they used to do it, really does work. Obviously, they have a lot of automated tools and other things they have to do to catch these bad guys, but it's interesting how ego does come into play so much there. Amazing. Well, we talked a lot about ransomware, understanding it, some of the motivations behind it. Let's talk maybe from a little more optimistic perspective for a moment there. We've got organizations constantly being targeted, bombarded with all kinds of evolving ransomware threats. We talked about ransomware as a service. And I want to think for a moment, and I'd love to hear from each of you. What do you think? Is it hopeless, or can organizations actually, take training on and get education, raise awareness throughout their organization, and actually have a fighting chance? What do you guys think about that? I don't know if you want to start us off, Justin. I'm kind of just following the Brady Bunch squares around here, and we'll start with you and get your thoughts on, again, security awareness and training. How important is that to an organization?
Yeah, thanks, Scott. I'd like to start by just saying it's imperative that we don't give up hope. I mean, accepting defeat is not an option. So we've got to figure out how to do defense better and be proactive about it. And there's a lot of ways to do that. And I'm really hopeful to hear some best practice. I mean, we got a great panel here. So I'll talk about the training. I'm an academic. I'm an educator, and we workforce development training as well. Bless you, Paul. And so there's a few things. It's very clear, the predominance of attacks start with phishing. So employee awareness, don't click the link. No, really, don't click the link. Please don't click the link. Don't download the macro-enabled email. No, really, don't download the. Come on, why are you still doing like that? It gets old. Somehow, it's always a thing, right? And I think there's a variety of tools that are useful for the training. Probably the largest and most mature of those tools is KnowBe4, which probably most folks on the call have heard of. If you haven't, I really recommend checking it out. There's a lot of really interesting videos and vignettes and training resources that make the job of training and awareness development easier for the IT team. There's some more organic kind of do-it-yourself based tools that where you can set up your own phishing campaigns using things like RealFish and a series of other things. And some of these are servers that you can download from GitHub repository and run yourself if you have like a pretty robust security team that wants to have more targeted and customized sends. You can clone emails. You can grab a LinkedIn invitation and see what sneaks through the net, right? No matter how many technology solutions we implement, there's always something that will squeak by, and then it's on the human being to recognize those indicators of suspicious activity: unfamiliar tone, greeting, spelling, grammar errors, of course, inconsistent name, some weird domains. The real thing that I think should alert folks, and it's kind of hard to develop a really refined sense of this, but a sense of urgency. You just got targeted for an HR investigation. You got to go enter your information here and or something that's really too good to be true. A USB drive with or some file attachment that's got all the payrolls of your group in it that you normally wouldn't see that sort of thing floating around. So it's tempting, right? You want to open it. Or there's some time sensitivity, right? So that's one category of training. The employee awareness, that's where most of the infections start. And I think there's that's 90% of the pyramid from my perspective. The 10% is security aware IT pros. There's a lot of settings and things that they need to know how to do, blocking responder attacks and I mean there's just a lot of things, right, that they need to know how to do to enable good security across the IT enterprise. And then you have sort of more advanced training options for those security practitioners to stay current in their field and get into more deep awareness, like threat hunting and more proactive looks at security. So I'll add one more thing and then I'll stop blabbering. We found that inevitably, most organizations tend to find cyber problems as technology problems without really appreciating the people and processes that feed. There's really three components, right? And within the people, we in the processes, specifically processes need measurements, otherwise they're useless, and people need incentives, otherwise they're never going to, and so maximizing the measurements of effectiveness and not so much the measurements of performance can be that's a bit of an art, but I say all that because the best types of training involve folks from well outside of the IT enterprise. Marketing, public relations, the finance office, HR, all of these components really have something important to do with the ransomware incident response. And so proactive organizations that bring together multi-domain, like the whole C-suite and the CEO or the president of the company together for some maybe a bit more beyond just a regular tick box tabletop into something that's a bit more interactive and live. We do that training at RIT, at the Rochester Institute of Technology, and we've seen great effects. We're not the only ones that do this, of course, and we got some great suggestions from IBM. They do this, and a few other groups. But that really is a best practice. I'm going to stop now.
Hey, a quick question for you, Justin, because you bring up a good point. So from a university level, you've got everybody, the staff there getting this awareness and training. Do students get involved in it too? Is that an important aspect of it?
Oh yeah, so we in two ways, right? Everybody that uses a computer in our university has to take a digital self-defense course, which is really kind of fundamental awareness course. And a lot of that's online training. There's some phishing tests that we do and so on. And then being a professor in the security department, we also work with students to do advanced curriculum development. So, for example, I worked with a team to develop some professional training on social engineering in depth, which involves a lot more than just phishing emails. There's phishing, voice-based pretext over the phone, which is as old as the telephone and super illegal, by the way. And then smishing with SMS based. I mean, there's all these different avenues. It's the same con artistry that started in the third oldest profession in the world or something. And ripping people off is an old art that we just need to get better. And then there's the other, social engineering in a broader sense, right? What does information and propagation do to manipulate public opinion and therefore affect these strategic objectives at the national level? That's a form of social engineering, and it can have real impacts on who's doing what at the at different decision points that require action, not just clicking an email maybe, but I'm not going to go down that road. But there's a lot of there's a lot of other potential impacts.
Yeah, good points there. Anyone else want to weigh in on it? Please, Roger.
Yeah,
go
can
ahead.
I just add something? I used to teach at Australian Defence Force College in Canberra, and they brought in 2016 that every undergrad that went through the university had to do a cybersecurity course. It was just a normal part of the degree what you were getting. And what it was designed to do, because these people are going from school to university to Defence Force, they literally noticed that there was a huge gap in this cyber space. And they implemented this, and it's been working really well because it raises the level and the awareness of the people who are going into the Defence Force. But I don't know if there's any other universities in Australia that are doing something similar to that, which is a pity, because it just lifts everybody's awareness. And once we got the awareness there, we can then make decisions about what we're going to implement, how we're going to train, what we're going to do with the information that we're getting out of threat intelligence. All of that then becomes something that we can actually leverage to make an organization, doesn't matter what size it is, doesn't matter whether it's a government department or a small not-for-profit, it makes them aware that cyber is something that really have to be addressed properly. Otherwise, they're just a sitting duck. And these are areas that we really need to focus on when it comes to ransomware, because they get in most cases in the simplest of ways because someone has made a mistake. And whether that is clicked on a link, not patched a system, been scammed, doesn't really matter, but they've got that foothold on a system, and that's all they're looking for. And once they've got that, then you've got major problems.
Yeah, brilliant. Paul, did you have your hand up too? I missed it.
Yeah.
And we'll get Sentinel.
Yes. The thing I would like to add is that obviously awareness is important, right? Because sometimes they say employees are the weakest link in your security, and that can be the case if the security awareness is very low. If awareness is higher, they can be your first line of defense. Having said that, I also don't think we need to only look at the awareness as the core issue here, because sometimes you see that employees are aware, but they're still not acting in compliance with what they know they should be doing. So they know they should be doing X, but they're doing Y because, just how you are supposed to work, right? Because, for instance, this phrase of don't click the link sounds great, but how often do you click the link every day? We all do that all day, every day, right? Because that's basically how the internet works. If I cannot click links anymore, I cannot use the internet. So some of the advice that we tend to give to people is not really sort of workable in progress. And I also believe that all the other things should be in place to make sure that people can work how they're supposed to work. And that does include clicking some links, but they need to be aware of sort of recognizing which ones they should be able to click or shouldn't click. But that is actually quite hard. So if I would send, I could probably draft a phishing email that any of us would click at some point. So for me, if you want to target me, send me lots of newsletters, and at some point I will definitely click the unsubscribe link because gotcha. I really hate those things, and I try to minimize the amount of spam in my inbox. So at some point, I think all of us will click, and the trick is of making sure the rest of the organization around it, so the IT measures and the processes that are in place, are actually able to handle people doing this normal business process of working with email and clicking links. So yeah, this also one thing to keep in mind, that it goes a bit beyond just being aware of some of these basic rules.
Yeah, good points there. Excellent points. Did you want to build on that, Senthil, please?
Yep, sure. I wanted to sort of expand on what Roger and Paul stated earlier on as well regarding training. And when we look at security and when we speak to CISOs and security consultants, they identify that very clearly the weakest link in the whole chain is the human factor. That's the weakest link in terms of security, right? And the way to mitigate it is training, and repetitive training with measurable matrix. And this is we found when we speak to customers, we found a different strategy that's been employed by certain organizations that are getting a bit more aware how to get the training in a measurable way. They do repeated trainings every quarter, and they mandate the employees to go through those trainings that specifically look at video cute small little videos trainings that go, and then that you go through and then you click through and then you have to answer those questions where you have a result outcomes. And if you fail to do those trainings, or if you do not do those trainings, what they do is they start revoking access to your tools that you actually need to use at work. And that sort of forces the employee to ensure that the trainings get done. And then that builds that brain muscle, sort of say, if I'm going to look at a phishing email, if I'm going to look, these are the points that I need to identify. And that's a repeated process. And it puts the onus back on the employees that they have to get that done, and they have to get it done to ensure that they actually go through the test and pass it.
Yeah. Let me just add one more point. I think you have to keep in mind, like, what is our goal here? Because you can lower the amount of employees, the percentage that will click on links in phishing emails, or lower the percentage that will fill in their credentials or execute a malicious attachment. But you can never get that to zero. So even at organizations that we do these kinds of tests for, you can maybe lower it from 60% to 40 to 20. There will always be people that will still click that link. So getting to zero is not the result that you should be striving for. The result you should be striving for is that the percentage of people that report a phishing email to your security department is higher than the percentage that would be enticed to click on a link and execute a malicious file. Because in that way, you will get reports, and then you can act on these reports, and then you can figure out what's going on, and you can see who else did receive this email, and can we maybe contact them and check if their systems were infected with this attachment. So that is what you should be striving for, to raise the resilience to such a level that more people are reporting it, so that you become aware and can act upon it, and then sort of handle the percentage that actually clicks on it.
I'd love to just commend that, Paul. That's really exact. I mentioned the measures of effectiveness. That is precisely, and I think that we have as a community this conception of security as a castle and a moat, and we got this indefensible perimeter, and that's where it needs to. Our attack surface is humongous, and people are the attack surface in a lot of cases. But there's an immune system concept that we can adopt where, yeah, maybe we have an initial point of infection, but if we can catch it in time, we prevent it from spreading. And especially, as Paul mentioned, we can't ever get that number to zero. It's just impossible. So if we think of that through, we should estimate the probability of a successful attack to be 100. Or 1 really. It's 100% likely that we're going to have a successful attack. So then what? How do we have all the mechanisms in place to prevent that from being a catastrophe? We stop it, we cordon off the people who did click the link because somebody thought ahead and reported it, and now within an hour or less, we've cut down on who was doing what, and now we've got a honed in thing that we can avoid the domain controller from getting compromised, for example.
Hey, I got a question for you guys. I get this all the time, and it always tied into ransomware. And if you were asked, what's one tip that you could share with somebody, somebody in a company comes up to you and says, hey, what's one thing that I could do or should do to be better prepared so I'm not a victim of ransomware? What's a standout in your mind, maybe at the top of your list? There's lots of things and levels, obviously, but based upon some of the expertise that you guys have. Anyone want to take a shot? What's the standout at the top of your list?
It would be
I get about 10 things usually, so it's hard for me to narrow it down to one, but It's not a trick question or anything. Don't worry. I'm just curious from your perspective, from what you've seen out there. What's one thing that that would come off your lips first and say, hey, make sure you're doing what?
Yeah, so me, I would say use multi-factor authentication everywhere. So I do a lot of ethical hacking assignments myself, try to hack into networks, try to hack through networks of organizations. And the biggest thing that I keep running into is this multi-factor authentication. And it's relatively painless for organizations to implement. So it causes a bit of friction for a user, but it's not really big. It causes a lot of friction for us as hackers when we're trying to get into networks. So the cost benefit here is hugely in favor of implementing this wherever you can. So I think that would be a really, really big first step.
Okay, good. So we multi-factor authentication, excellent takeaway. Senthil, what's your thoughts?
To add on to Paul, complex password enforcement policy, and make sure that it's a constant rotation of that constant expiry and the rotation of the password. So you do not, you prevent your users from rotating the password, and you ensure that the password is actually gets changed every 45 to 60 days.
Okay, curious why you say that. What is there an advantage to changing your password that often? I tend to, and this is not an argument, but I tend to encourage people not to change their password if it's actually long and strong. I think length of a password duration is, to me, one of fundamentally the most important things, because it's harder to hack the longer it is. But obviously you want it strong and diverse. But just changing the frequency of it, does it really make it stronger?
Well, adding on to that, right? Change the password length is one thing. Ensuring the password's complex together with the combination of the length. So a lot of times it becomes cumbersome to do it as a practice. So getting a tool that actually does this for you, a password manager, and to have that tool, because you'll be surprised to find that if someone's using the same level of password, if they use 10 different tools, they'll use the same password for those 10 different tools. And that becomes a point of inflection as well. So having a tool that will support you to manage those complex passwords, and having a long password helps you to go through that process. And very recently though, there was a case where a lot of times where passwords get compromised and people dump these passwords on the internet and on the dark web. There's actually websites they can actually pull up and say, this username, what's the frequency of this password being used? I've had scenarios where some of my passwords were there as well in the past, back before I had all this awareness. So yes, having a password that's the same is going to cause you to use those passwords across various tools, and you run into the trap of falling into the passwords being repetitive and being found out.
Yeah. So you're talking about discipline. That's a good point there, not to reuse the same password. Excellent. Yeah.
Can I just jump in for 1 second?
Please go ahead.
Because I will correct a lot of passwords in my life, and I would say the absolute most important thing about passwords is passwords should be unique. If they're unique, all things after that don't really matter as much. So using unique passwords is the most important thing, because that means if one of your passwords for one system is compromised, you cannot use it to target other systems. So exactly as Senthil just explained, that's why password managers are important, because they allow you to use different passwords for different accounts. I checked my password manager the other day. I think I have like 300 accounts in there for all sorts of different things, and that's just not possible to keep a distinct, unique password for each one of them if you wouldn't use one of these tools. Now, after a password being unique, the next most important thing would be the length of the password, and that only matters in a subset of cases. Because if someone can steal your password because they're logging your keystrokes, or because it was hacked and they got it from memory from your system, then it doesn't matter if it's how long it is or how complex it is. They just see your plain text password. So only in the very small subset of cases where they are able to steal all of the password hashes and then they try to crack them, then length and complexity and these sorts of requirements come into play. And then the thing you need to keep in mind is that for every character that you add, the key space that someone would have to brute force in order to be able to recover your password, I think it increases by 96 times. So that's the amount of different combinations that you can make on a regular European or American keyboard. So every character that you add to your password multiplies that key space that someone has to brute force by almost 100 times. And so it doesn't really matter if you use a special character or a number, because someone who's trying to crack that password doesn't know the kind of assumptions that they have to have about the password. So they will probably first try lowercase, then lowercase uppercase, then lowercase uppercase and decimals, and then finally add in the special characters. But I would say everything above, say, 14, 15 characters, if they're using a semi-decent hashing algorithm, then that's just not crackable. So as long as you're not using a word that someone else has previously used as their exact password, then everything above that is fine. Even if you're only using something that is very simple and doesn't contain all of the different categories. It doesn't have to be some kind of gibberish. It can be words that are tied together with a number or a special character, because length is everything, and after passwords being unique.
Something like password 123 maybe, or?
Well, maybe not that, but for instance, if I would have to set a password for today,
capital P.
it could be panel discussion at EC Council. It would be a great password. It's not something that I've used elsewhere. It's lengthy. It's not super complex, but it is a terrific password for if I would have to access something for today.
Yeah, I think to your point is really length is really important. Number one, it stands out in my book, and I always say obscurity. I tried one time just for fun to hack into one of my friend's accounts. This was one of the mileage accounts he had with United or whatever. And I said, I wonder if I can do this. I knew what his username was, obviously his name. What would I be able to hack into his password to get it? And I said, how long it'll take me? I said, let me try it. And I said, before trying anything, I said, let me just think about him from a social engineering standpoint, understanding him, his likes, so on and so forth. Loves hockey. I know he talks about his favorite hockey player. And again, I know him, he's a friend. So maybe this is not 100% the best way. But I think from a social engineering point, when you try to understand a person, their likes, their dislikes, where they work, hobbies, so on and so forth, and I'm not kidding you, on my first guess, I said, I'll never get this, no way. And I got in. I got so scared. And that was the scary part, but no, it was even scarier. I said, let me go to some of his other accounts, like his bank account and his stock account and other things. And guess what? He reused the same password across multiple login sites. And I was like, oh, and he works for a financial company. So what does that tell you about people? Sometimes we could say all these things, long, strong passwords, obscure, use a good password manager. People in the industry, in our industry even, are not necessarily disciplined to make change. And that is a concern there. Please, Justin, I saw your hand up there. Jump in, please.
Yeah, Scott, you mentioned something that I've found too in doing pen tests. Of course, we grab the password hashes. A variety of ways we might get to the domain controller, grab the password hashes, and then we do see which ones we can crack. And so the dictionary that we're using to search against becomes really important. So usually we'll use an offline tool, John the Ripper or something like this. And then the dictionary that we provide, the standard dictionary gets you 10-15% of the passwords in a moderately well-enforced password policy, right? Just because it's combinations of things that are pretty common. I implemented, in particular, a social engineering word list based on the organization. And there's tools actually that help you automate the generation of word lists from social engineering, like Facebook accounts, and you take the pet's name and a few birthday combinations, the kids' names and favorite sports teams and all these things to develop another word list. And that actually almost doubled the likelihood of impact. And these are publicly available tools. You can get them off GitHub. Cool comes to mind. CEWL, and CUP is another one. CUPP. Two tools that I've used personally. But that's it's an important thing to test. And I guess that segues into, we talked about MFA and good password policies. I would add a third for, how to prevent ransomware is actually being proactive about testing using third-party tests. So a penetration test, an ethical hack, a white hat hacker, a red team, especially one that's outside your organization, and changing those periodically, who you're contracting with to provide this service. Some industries, FFIEC for the financial markets in New York State requires an annual pen test because it actually does improve security. I'd say that's a really good sort of durable way. And they're going to point out things like MFA and weak password policies, but whatever else is out there, right? If there's a server message block outbound, they're going to find that and they're going to tell you about it. And then it's a form of awareness building for the technology experts to remediate some of those gaping holes. So I'd say that's my suggestion for ransomware prevention.
Excellent. And I know we're a wireless cybersecurity company, and we had a penetration testing. I'm thinking, we're going to breeze through this, no problem. Not necessarily. A third party, to your point, they will identify things that you just can't clearly see. And I think that's the beauty of it. Then you can shore up these vulnerabilities and open your eyes to things that are, you assume that you're secure and you're safe. And I think that's part of the problem. Everybody does. After a penetration test, I think it does open your eyes up. And especially if you're willing to make those adjustments and the changes, you got to be willing to say, yeah, bad on me. That was a dumb mistake, or I didn't even notice that. Thank you. Let's fix it now. And then you start to actually make progress. And that's really important to stay safe from ransomware attacks. Anyone stand out for yourself, Roger?
Mine is making sure that you're patching everything. It's one of those things that people just overlook really easily. But I'm not just talking about patching operating systems. I'm talking about patching switches, patching routers, making sure applications are patched to the level. But it also makes sure that, as you can understand, with October last year, with the Log4j stuff that everybody literally ran around in ever decreasing circles with, when you find out that someone has used an application in their application that they haven't actually had, I suppose, not so much the right to use, but the reasoning behind using, what we had last year significantly highlighted some of the problems that we get with just a simple way of logging information in an application. I don't need to write that. I'm going to steal it from GitHub or borrow it from GitHub is probably a better way of putting it. I need to realize that, A, it's not patched, it's not updated, it's never improved. We see things that come through from Dell and HP that have been on laptops for the last 20 years and they're still using version 1.1. That's the type of thing that you really have to be aware of. Because each one of those may have a vulnerability. I'm not saying they have, but they may have a vulnerability, or they may have a vulnerability that is not known by HP, Dell, Java, the whole lot. So if you're patching everything to your own level, then anything that gets through that patching process is then something that is not known. And that way then gives you the opportunity to put other things in place. As you said, having that internal capability of being able to see, going what Paul was saying, that being able to see what is happening across the network, to be able to see that something has gained a foothold on one system and is trying to access another system, and getting that information into some sort of visibility, I think, is probably very important as well. Because if you haven't got that visibility, all this stuff is just happening under the ground, and you don't even know about it until literally it's too late. And you have to have some sort of system in place to do that.
Yeah, well said. Here's one I often get. Companies will say to me, or I'll talk to somebody in IT, and they'll say, "We're okay, Scott, don't worry. We have a backup that'll prevent us from being a victim of ransomware." And I look and go, "What?" Help us understand that a little bit. Are backups even important?
Yes.
Yes. Please go ahead.
We work on a principle of the 3-2-1 rule. 3 copies of everything in 2 different locations, and one of those locations is isolated and not connected to the system all the time. But it also has a caveat on that. It's great having a backup, But if you don't test it, you don't try it out, you don't make sure that you can recover from it, then you might as well just have a USB drive sitting in the corner doing just gathering dust. You have to take a live attitude to the whole thing. You've got to, and also in addition to that, when you are restoring it, when you are testing it, you are then finding your own weaknesses. We just implemented a new SQL database. Why is that not on the backup? Those are the type of things that you need to be very aware of, because otherwise something happens. The first thing you do is you pull out your backup and go, well, half the data is missing. It wasn't backed up 6 months ago. We've got to go back 6 months and we've now got to build the whole system. Those are some of the big problems when it comes to backups, because everybody thinks, oh yeah, I've got a backup, that's it. Okay, and it's one of those things that will pull you out of a lot of trouble, but only on the condition that it is in the right format to be able to use.
Yeah, good point there. Good point. Go ahead, Santo.
So taking that Roger's comment one step further, I think when we look at backups, and it's hard to relate really about backups and ransomware resistance, but the next generation backup is what it is, and how we look at recovering from a ransomware attack. Because a lot of times it's not a case of if I'm going to get hit, it's a question of when am I going to get hit by ransomware. And how you recover from that is to have a backup, as exactly what Roger said, 3-to-1 backup, but taking it a step further, a backup that's native SaaS, a backup that's in the cloud, that's completely air-gapped, offsite and away from your production workload. And also a backup solution. But why I say cloud backup, why I say offsite, is because ransomware nowadays, as what we've looked at, they're pretty smart. Where they come in, they're a tiny payload. They come into your organization and they rely on the executioner to take the next step. They target specifically these backup tools and the backup extension, the file extensions of a backup product, and they cripple you down from there. And then they ingest and go through the entire organization looking at other data sets. Having a backup that's completely offsite, plus when we talk about the next generation backup, we're looking at a backup that can actually go through the entire backup set, being able to pick and choose individual snapshot and versions of a latest copy of the file that's not infected with ransomware, and build a golden snapshot that will help you to quickly recover from your ransomware attack. Typically looking at a day 2 scenario is what it needs to be, because typical ransomware recovery goes through these 4 phases: identification, isolation, investigation, and then recovery. The recovery bit is the critical aspect, because a typical recovery period for an organization that's been hit with ransomware is anywhere from 20 to 30 days. Imagine that for an organization. The data is the blood and lifeline of an organization. How would an organization look like if they're going to recover from a normal operation after 30 days? And you spoke about Lincoln College. They literally shut down. Yeah. They cannot come back out of it. So having a solution out there, backup is key, and having a next generation backup that's stored away, air-gapped, completely immutable and offsite is key as well.
Yeah, good point. Maybe we'll get one final thought. I think, Paul, you had something to say, then we're going to hit some questions, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure. So I agree with a lot of what Santo said, which is what I was going to say, actually. I think lots of organizations think we have this backup thing covered, but maybe they should review their plans, because what you thought would work in the case of a fire is not something that would work against ransomware. It's especially about this whole thing. Can they access the backups? Can they destroy these backups? So even if, for instance, you think, okay, we're all clear, we have them stored in the cloud somewhere. Well, maybe if someone can take over your entire network, steal all the passwords for all the accounts for all your employees, then maybe they can also steal the credentials that are necessary to log into your cloud environment, and they can just shut down your subscription, delete everything that's there, and then all of a sudden all your backups are gone. And also one thing to keep in mind is, what are you going to restore to? So maybe you think, let's go back 1 week in time, let's go back a month in time. Or maybe they've been in your network for 3 months, and maybe the vulnerability that they got into your network through has been there for 2 years. So if you just restore to a previous copy, then they can exploit maybe the same vulnerability to get in again. or maybe you're storing a copy that already had their malware in there somewhere. So actually, if you want to do the whole restoration thing, you first have to figure out what was patient zero, how did they move through the network, what kind of artifacts are through my environment, before you can actually start recovering to some of these old snapshots. Otherwise, you're just offering a pathway into your network once again.
Yeah, good point. Please, Justin, you had a thought too?
Yeah, I'll make it quick. I'll echo everything that we've heard, but I want to add just a couple of sort of things to think about for those seeking to properly implement backups. The best practices we've seen, these are integrated across the organization and defined within the business impact analysis for the organization down to the team level. And there's really two key sort of definitions in that business impact analysis: the recovery point objective, which is your maximum data loss. How far back in time can you go and assume that, hey, I can afford to lose a day's data, 5 days data, whatever it is. And then your recovery time objective, the minimum level, acceptable level for operation. So that's how long can I afford to have my systems down, and that really helps to contextualize, what the response should look like. And nobody wants to have to open up the Bitcoin and pay out on a ransom, right? And there's like legal concerns with doing that in a lot of cases, but some businesses will say, I don't care. I can't afford to have a day down without access. It's just not worth it. I don't care what it costs. So having that analysis built in, so the decision isn't one in a panic, it's something that you've done some planning processes for, really can help make that backup so much more useful than if you say, I got backups, and then you find, oh goodness, they're infected too, and we're down, and we only have one site, and so all the things that we've heard, really start to become more palpable for all of the organization, not just a few components of it.
Yeah, excellent.
Tweak in there too.
Yeah, no worries. In fact, I heard one stat recently. It was something to the nature of about 28% of backups that companies try to resort to don't even work. In other words, to your point, they don't even test them. They're not properly backed up, so on and so forth. That was a pretty high statistic to me. I was like, wow, that's scary. So even though they think they're doing the right thing, backing up data, if it's not done properly, not checked and tested, it may not solve their problem. So I think it's important having a regular backup plan and doing it properly, checking it, testing it is really important there. I think because of time, we wanted to check in with Richa and see, was there any questions that the audience wanted to pose to these wonderful panelists here?
Thank you so much, Scott. Thank you to all our wonderful panelists for such an insightful and informative session. That was a very interesting webinar, and the response we have received from the audience is really amazing. Our chat box is flooded with the question. So before we take the questions, it is for the attendees. The session is in sync with the EC Council certification CND, which is Certified Network Defender. EC Council CND product maps to many roles in the industry, like network security engineer, network security administrator, network security analyst, network security architects, network defense technician, security operator, etc. Anyone with a CND certification is eligible for 135,000 plus job vacancy globally. Now we'll take some questions we have received. So the first question is from Mahmood. It looks like the ransom attacks increase with the growth of cryptocurrencies. Is there any data to show how ransom attacks growth is related to the growth of cryptocurrencies? Or is there any analytics data to show how ransom attacks growth are related? I think it's the same question, but is there any data to show how ransom attacks growth is related to the growth of cryptocurrencies?
I'll jump in from what I've seen in the academic research. I think it's an interesting question. I have not seen anything specifically that suggests a causal relationship. That cryptocurrencies cause an increase in ransomware. Though I think that could be a state of the maturity of the research. First we have to prove coincidence. I think that's kind of it makes sense, right? The digitization that allows for cryptocurrency growth is also one that allows for ransomware to be applied. And I think, defining what we mean by growth, the proliferation of the number of non-fungible tokens or cryptocurrencies, and the number of ransomware attacks, or the financial, the volume of traded activity or held Bitcoin or some other coin, relative to the volume of ransomware demands. I'm not sure, but I will say that, back, like, the first use I've ever seen for pre-Bitcoin cryptocurrency was actually a ransomware attack. So there is it's a good question. I haven't seen academically that we've really investigated it well, but maybe in practice or in industry we've seen something.
Yeah. Go ahead, Paul.
Maybe an interesting point to make here is that this whole ransomware scene didn't come out of nothing. I've been following some of the people that are in these ransomware groups for like over a decade. And back then, these same people were also trying to get into the systems of people and trying to monetize that in some way or another. And back then, they typically used banking malware. So they would infect someone's system and they would try to monetize that access by changing their banking transactions. And in order to cash that out, they had this whole system of trying to send that money into offshore banks and people that were used as mules in order to cash out. So even before these cryptocurrencies existed, they were able to monetize their access that they acquired to systems. Did cryptocurrencies make that easier? Sure. It is part of how they sort of were able to revolutionize and evolve a new business model, because banking malware is just not as lucrative as the ransomware attacks are. And cryptocurrencies make it easier because they allow you to store that money at a certain point without having to worry about banks that are actually trying to trace that money while you're trying to sort of cash it out. So yes, it makes it easier, but if there were no cryptocurrencies, they could still perform these ransomware attacks and then just through the traditional means, through the same means as they were cashing out money in the times of banking malware, they would still be able to keep this business model going.
Yeah, good point there. All right.
100%.
Hey, was there any other questions there, Richa?
Yes, we have. Before I take the second question, we're just launching the poll for the audiences if they would like to know about our certification. So moving on to the next question. In regards to cybersecurity, which course is best to study for housing company?
Hello.
Hello, I think we went dark for a second. Can you hear me?
I think we're just, yeah.
We're doing the
Can you
poll
hear me?
right now.
Oh,
Yes,
yeah, okay.
I guess I lost
Can you repeat the
everyone.
question,
Yes,
please? I didn't
yes,
catch
I
that.
repeat the question.
I got
In
distracted by
regards
the
to
notes.
cybersecurity,
Yeah.
yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Perfect, perfect. It's a question by Nana. In regards to cybersecurity, which course is best to study for housing company?
Right.
Anybody want to take that? Any type of courses that are good from a cybersecurity perspective? You said for a housing company, so somebody in real estate, I'm assuming.
Probably, yes.
But no clue.
That's a
Can we
good
move on to the
question.
next question if you want?
Hmm.
Perfect. So I'll move on to the next question. When a ransom attack takes place, the hackers, criminals at times request a payment. Is it advisable to pay these criminals before they sell the data on the black market?
I can
I
start.
can take that.
Oh,
Sure.
go ahead. Sorry. Hey,
So
there we go.
I-
Better now. This helps us
There we
cue.
go.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Justin. Yeah, I think you wanted to say something.
Sure. Okay. And I apologize if I jumped in front of somebody, but I'm sure I'll leave some meat on the bone. So from a decision-making point of view, there's a few things that you need to consider before thinking, paying. And depending on who's behind the attack, it could come back as you're, providing financial support to a terrorist organization. So that is probably kind of worst case scenario. Could be difficult to prove that you were knowledgeable about this thing, but that's kind of the hammer, right? That's the worst case scenario from a prosecutorial perspective. There's a fundamental economic calculation: is the data lost worth the ransom? Mm-hmm. Right? I mean, that's really it. So then understanding how long you can go, how much this resource is worth to your organization in by the hour or by the day of potential downtime, really will help inform that situation. I will say that I've seen some pretty evolved economic models employed by ransomware attackers, and the price points that they select are not arbitrary, and it's not a one size fits all. It's actually pretty attuned to the asset base of the organization, both in terms of computers infected, and market size, like how large the company is. And so they actually try to make it convenient and affordable while still being painful, for you to pay the ransom. But that's a business decision, and it's a risk decision fundamentally. If it's an existential threat because you can't use your data, and the price point to get the ransom paid isn't too high, then it's something to think about. Though, there is the downside potential of sponsoring, this illegal activity and potentially facing some lumps in the courts, or even a reputation hit that you're complicit, you're negotiating with terrorists or whatever. So that's kind of my 2 cents on it.
Jump in there. So I would approach it in a similar way. I'm not from Europe, so the maybe the law's a little bit strict here. So I don't think any company here has ever faced any sort of fines or whatever for paying up to these criminals. But I think the main reason why you don't want to pay them is because it just makes this business model too lucrative, and it's more a moral point of view that you really don't want to pay them if you can avoid it. Having said that, I can also understand that individual companies, if they're faced with going bankrupt and firing all their employees or paying the ransom, sometimes they find themselves in a position where they feel they have no other option than paying the ransom. And even if you think you can recover because you have the backups, if they have stolen your most sensitive information or sensitive information pertaining to your employees or customers, I also understand why in some cases you would decide to pay the ransom. But ideally, from a moral point of view, and in order not to sort of incentivize this business model, try not to pay wherever you can. So especially, some organizations are in a better position to fend this off without paying. So for instance, if you work for the government and you're a government organization, then it's probably much easier to say, we're just not going to pay. However long it takes, weeks, months, years, we will just rebuild. We're not going to fund this. If you're in manufacturing and your company will go bankrupt within a week if the systems don't keep running, then you have another kind of decision to make. So it really depends on the context as well.
Yeah, excellent.
One of the big problems that people have to face in a ransomware attack is the unknown component about whether they've copied the data off before they've encrypted or after encrypted it, so that they can use that as a blackmail process. Okay, yes, you're not going to pay because you're going to recover from backup. Well, we're going to release this stuff to the internet. So that gives everybody another option of what that decision process of whether they're going to actually pay for the ransom or not. It's a big line that you have to draw in the sand that literally says we're not going to pay or we are going to pay. And some of the people that we've been involved in, the wringing of hands and everything that goes with it, it is noticeable. It is something you just don't want to be on the wrong side of. And I think that's one of the things about ransomware itself. It's literally a violation. And if you address it like that and get to the point where you're going to protect yourself as much as possible about getting to that point, then you're in a better place anyway. We've got to just try and get people to realize that ransomware is something that, yeah, we got to live with, but we've got to make it as hard as possible for them to encrypt our data.
Yeah, good point.
Yeah, one more point that made you maybe think about what you said, Roger, is these negotiations. I think it's also good to keep in mind that it's always good to go into this negotiation, even if you do not intend to pay, because it will allow you to buy some time. And usually you can get all sorts of information from these ransomware attackers. So if you ask them about the data that they stole, a tree list, a directory listing of all the data that they stole, usually even before you pay, they will be more than willing to show you what they stole in order to sort of put extra pressure on you, like, look, this is the data that we have. So even without paying and just by negotiating and asking them for some of this information, it will allow you to better prepare for what may be coming once they put this data out there. So I would say always go into these negotiations, even if it's just for stalling time and getting information from them about how they operate, what data they stole, trying to see if you can get some information from them that may be useful in police or criminal investigations, etc.
Yeah, good point.
Yeah, totally agree.
As well is about cybersecurity insurance and the processes that are in place to counteract to that. So one, data, the risk of the data, and being able to protect yourself against that by ensuring the processes and the tools are in place together, combined with the cybersecurity insurance. That's an interesting trend that we're seeing across in the Australian region over here, largely.
Yeah, good point there. And in cybersecurity insurance, we didn't talk a whole lot about that, but I always look at that as that's something that's going to help offset and balance out the risks per se. It's not really a solution and just say, well, I got cyber insurance, go take care of the problem there. Because they're going to come in there hopefully as a third party and help perhaps negotiate. Perhaps they have a decryption keys. They're going to work in conjunction with law enforcement. So you should bring law enforcement in there as well. Because not doing all of those things will, and that's what a lot of companies do, I found, is they don't tell anybody. They wait too long and try to figure it out themselves before they bring the third parties in. And now the damage is done too far, and they don't have the evidence, the forensics. A lot of things can't be done to prevent future attacks against other companies and individuals and things like that. So
I'd like
please,
to
Justin,
add a brief point, if you don't mind. Sometimes bringing in the third party can be instrumental in affecting an actual solution as well. For example, I had a student who we part of our program at RIT is a cooperative education. So they take, paid internships that are part of their educational design. And they meet with professors after they're done to review kind of what they learned and how beneficial it was and what we need to do with the curriculum and things like this. Anyway, so in meeting with one of the students, actually this past fall, having followed a summer internship at a large, I can't name names, but a large incident response team, they reported a ransomware attack. And he was the student actually was able to successfully break the ransomware encryption because there was a faulty random number generation seed based on a timestamp in the computer system. And he plotted the range, searched the function, found the key, and actually built a decryption tool.
Nice.
As part of which I thought was really impressive. I mean, certainly for an undergrad to do that kind of work is just amazing. But also, it just underscores that they have, a lot of the third party, your vendors, your insurance company, the feds, and even some of the providers, can help actually develop fixes and in a reasonable amount of time. I think he was able to achieve that in just a day or two. So that's not that bad. And then anybody else that effectively destroyed the ransomware's viability.
Excellent, thank you. All right, how was our time, Richa?
Yes, we have a few more minutes, so I'll only take 2 questions now.
Please.
So the second last question is, Are application whitelisting solutions such as Microsoft App Locker that prevents non-whitelisting files from executing effective? Is it effective against ransomware?
Yes and no. Go ahead, Roger.
Yeah, it's a case of yes and no. One of the problems with whitelisting is actually the implementation of it more than anything else, because it's got to be done properly. Otherwise, you cause yourself major problems across the board. But once it's done properly, yes, it has a really good opportunity to reduce the chance of malware getting onto a system. But there are other ways of doing it, and that's the other thing. For instance, if you got Word on a whitelist and they hit you with a macro that's targeting Word's going to run. So you're not going to have that. You're going to have a similar problem. But it is a deterrent more than anything else, and it is pretty effective as well.
Yeah, exactly. It's about making life more difficult for attackers, and it's definitely if
totally
you
agree.
implement strict allow listing, I would call it. It would definitely make life more difficult. But having said that, there are all sorts of techniques. We call them living off the land or lol bins, which are executables, which are legitimate, which are signed, which you could also use to sort of get them to execute your code. And some of these tools are just regular Microsoft tools that are part of the operating systems. So yes, it will make it more difficult. It raises the bar, but it's definitely not a silver bullet.
Excellent.
Thank you all. I'll take the last question.
Hmm.
Regarding the recovery stage, based on the history of attacks in recent year, is there any statistics that can indicate the percentage of security in the use of backup based on the time elapsed since the snapshot?
Well, I can take that. It would really depend on the tool that you're using, and that's what we talked about. Having a backup that's immutable, that's offsite, and also a tool that's able to build those snapshots automatically. And see, that's what we call as part of the next generation backup, right? So there are existing players out there in the market. There are new players out there in the market. There are also ones that are looking beyond just standard data recovery options, right? This is called as part of ransomware recovery mitigation, and these solution providers look at specifically the day two scenario. What do you do when you're hit, and how do you come out of the situation? Is your backup tool smart enough to go through and extrapolate that snapshot? Because it works in combination of your investigation process as well. And as Paul has mentioned earlier, a typical ingestion period for ransomware could be anywhere from 60 to 90 days, even a year or even 6 months or so. How are you going to recover a data set if you're just going to rely on a backup that's 30 days old or even 6 days old or months old? So your tool now needs to be able to do it in an automated fashion. It will need to go in, sniff through each individual snapshot, pick the latest copy of your file based on the timestamp that you provided, build that golden image, and then help you to recover that. So you now, hand on heart, can put and say, yep, I've got this snapshot, and I know based on the tool that I've used, it's a clean snapshot. Now, reverse that on a typical traditional recovery scenario, if you don't have this tool, is that you've got to restore, you got to isolate your network, you got to pick those individual snapshot, restore it to an isolated location, run a scan against it, ensure it's clean, and then you start recovering. That's just one workload, one snapshot. Imagine if you have 10 servers. Imagine if you have 100 servers. How long that's going to take, right? So it really depends on the tool. And there are some providers out there that look at those scenarios and they automate that recovery process and they simplify the process. So it's all about the tools that you use.
Excellent. All right, thank you. I think that brings us to the end of the webinar. Thank you so much again, EC Council University and these great panelists for sharing their insight and some great questions there too. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you
Thank
again
you.
to our wonderful panelists for such an insightful session. I would like to thank our panelists, Justin, Roger, Senthil, Paul, for answering those questions. and sharing the great presentation knowledge to our global audience. I would also like to thank Scott for leading this session so smoothly, like always. It was a pleasure to have you all with us, and we're really looking forward for more and more session with you. Since we're getting close to the end of our time together, is there one thing you would like to tell our audience which to take away from this session?
I'll start, I guess. I would like to say, when we think about cybersecurity, a lot of us tend to talk about all the negative things, and it could be a little depressing, but I think it's something I tend to look at it very optimistically, that we can make a difference if we work together, if we do as the different things that they've shared there, actually implement some of these best practices and make a difference and take actionable changes. I'm optimistic for the future as technology advances, that we properly use technology. It's not hopeless. And I always say we should all work as hard as we can to make it really, really hard for the hackers and cyber criminals, make their job very difficult. And eventually they'll move on to other targets and to other types of crime probably, or eventually just get caught.
I'd say when we talk to customers, when we talk to clients, we find some interesting answers when we talk to CIOs, CTOs, CISOs. Some of them feel that a ransomware attack is a resume generating event. And that's primarily because of the lack of preparedness against this kind of attacks. I think readiness and ransomware recovery readiness is key, and being able to look ahead and use the tools that's out there in the market and use the right tools to be ready is the key, and not to ever give up.
Yeah, who's next? So I would say we should expect this issue to only grow, because the business model underlying ransomware attacks is just really lucrative. That these people are making lots of money driving around in Lamborghinis, like literally. Their returns are really low. Most of them are in Russia. We should not expect people that are operating from Russian soil to be apprehended for attacks on Western countries anytime soon, geopolitically speaking. So I think this is going to grow. If you're thinking about how should I defend my organization against these types of activities, my advice would be adopt an assume breach methodology. So think about any random point of your network. What if that is somehow compromised? How can I still defend my network by adopting defense in depth principles? So multiple layers that they would have to go through, trying to create spots that they have to go through in order to move from point A to B, and trying to focus your efforts there, because this defensive game, you're playing on your soil, it's your network, you should know it better than these attackers do, so you're in a good position to defend there. So try to focus your efforts there.
I agree with everybody. Sorry, Justin. When it comes to what we can do for ourselves, it's a case of really making that decision that you're going to actually do something. It's no use going, yeah, we're too small, or won't happen to us, and all the platitudes we get that say that people aren't going to invest in security. The moment you flip that around and say, yes, we could be compromised, people then actually start thinking about, how do I stop it from happening? And I think that in some of our conversations that we have with not-for-profit organizations is, once you change that concept or perception, people then start investing in security properly. And they then sit down and go, what can we do? How can we stop it from happening? What can we implement? How can we train our people? All of those sort of things that are really important to being aware about what the bad guys can do. And to me, that is one of the things that we need to do. We need to be able to flip their attitude to it won't happen to it can happen. What are you going to do about it? And that's really what we need to focus on more than anything else.
I guess that leaves me. I'd say assume it's going to happen, but that you don't have to take it lying down. And I think that will to fight an active, intelligent adversary is is one that we should adopt, and maybe remember that the plan itself is not going to solve the problem, but the process of planning is what you need to focus on. It's a kind of a quote from von Moltke, a military officer from Prussia, who's actually analyzed Napoleon warfare and so on. A plan is useless, but the planning is indispensable. And so, thinking about how to respond to ransomware, don't think that just because you have a plan, you're good. The process of planning, engaging the right people in the planning, is what allows you to survive an active, intelligent adversary that's seeking to outsmart your plan. But knowing that you can iterate on the plan in real time to defeat this threat is, it's possible, it's achievable, and you don't have to give up hope before you even start. I guess that's a lot of what we've already heard here, but that's my take on it.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you again. I would also like to thank our attendees for attending the session. We really appreciate your time. Before we end the session, I would also like to announce our next Cyber Talk session on the topic Core Digital Forensic Skills for Investing Cyber Incident, which is scheduled for May 13. The session is an expert presentation by Robert Fright, Senior Vice President, Global Head of Forensics and Investigation Sandline. So you can register to our website, which is given in the chat section. Hope to see you all on the 13th May. On behalf of Cyber Talks and our presenter, thank you again for joining us today and have a great day. You all may disconnect the line. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Justin, Roger, Scott, and Senthil. Have a good day. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks again. Cheers.